I'm pleased to have the opportunity to contribute on this debate and
afterwards.
Pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this particular bill. And just to reference Deputy Murphy's reference to non-conforming use, I couldn't agree more, Deputy, that there's quite a number of non-conforming properties, properties that have in particular instances residential zoning but actually commercial uses, but because they're over the 12 years they're not permitted, the council cannot pursue them, and I do think that's an issue that we should address. I actually drafted a bill a number of years ago on this very subject to try and capture that, because it's inherently unfair, as Deputy Murphy correctly pointed out. So, but I'll come back to that a little bit later on. I think all of us understand that the collection of commercial rates is an integral part of funding our local authorities right across the state in combination with the local property tax. But when addressing commercial rates, of course, you have to be cognizant of the responsibility to ensure that we don't put an unnecessary, I should say, burden or detract from the viability of small businesses that populate our country right up and down it. The bill does provide for important measures to ensure that rates are paid to the local authority. For instance, the provision which prohibits or permits, I should say, an obligation on the owners of commercial properties to ensure that unpaid rates are paid prior to the sale of a property is very important. But again, for the reasons that have been outlined by some of the previous contributors, that does present with issues. And the next point, I suppose, is really important in the context of this bill and any future legislative changes in this area. And that is that the local authorities have the discretion to pursue matters where it is appropriate to do so, where it is fair to do so. Because there are often businesses out there who might inadvertently rent a property, as has happened on a number of occasions. And I think it's very unfair that a property owner or indeed the next tenant in a property gets stuck with somebody else's bill. I think it's a little bit unfair. There are some local authorities that deal with it differently, but from a legislative standpoint, I do think that we should be providing uniformity right across the board. I heard in the Minister's contributing speech that some local authorities, I think he mentioned Dublin and another city, permit a reduction of up to 50%, whereas some local authorities are permitted to 100% waiver for vacant property. So these are issues that I think we really do need to address, because if we want to incentivise companies, particularly those coming in from overseas, to locate in Ireland, we have to give everybody a level playing field, so that our local authorities down the country, for instance, can compete with Dublin, and indeed our rural constituencies and counties can compete with our urban environments or regional cities. I think it's really important that local authorities, though, have the certainty that the rate system provides, and indeed that this bill will enhance in terms of the appropriate level of maintenance of existing amenities to the benefit of all, not just the business community, but of course the residents as well. The completion of such works would be significantly hindered without the collection of commercial rates. I do note that the legislation provides local authorities with the means to introduce targeted rates alleviation schemes, as I've just mentioned, or waivers, and the purpose of these waivers being to support the implementation of national and local policy objectives. I understand that that's been done with policies like development plans and national planning policy in mind, and perhaps consideration, Minister, should be given to the use of similar waivers in various policy areas. And I wish particularly to raise a matter that I've raised with Minister Murphy and indeed Minister Donoghue in the past, and that's in relation to childcare providers. As the Chairman of the Oireachtas Committee on Children and Youth Affairs, most childcare providers pay commercial rates on the facilities that they use, and this can have a significant knock-on effect for childcare costs to parents, and indeed it may put pressure on pay levels for staff in certain instances. Too often in this House we talk about the need to actively tackle the cost of childcare, which can be equivalent to a second mortgage payment for many families. We discuss empowering people to return them to work, yet childcare costs can constitute a very significant barrier for parents and guardians to get back into the workforce. And perhaps in addressing the cost of childcare, we should examine the possibility of making changes with regard to commercial rates for childcare operators. And I would argue that this should be done in order to examine particular providers in Dublin and other urban areas where commercial rates can have a detrimental impact on the affordability of both operating costs and subsequent costs for families. Where childcare providers pay commercial rates on their facilities, it is inevitable that these costs are passed on to families in the amounts that they are charged for the service that they are receiving. And this is not really a fact that's deniable, to be fair. Furthermore, the fact that the rate of pay received by many workers in the childcare sector remains very low. Given the overheads that service providers face, they may not have sufficient profit to increase the wage for many workers as a result of the measures to cover such costs and ensure that families are not priced out of the service. And I appreciate, Minister, that of course this rolls across into the Department of Children and Youth Affairs in terms of subsidies and support payments, but it is a small thing that can be done. There are an awful lot of small childcare providers out there that are registered with their local childcare committee and indeed are paying rates. And it should be borne in mind that, you know, a little bit like approved housing bodies being exempted from certain things like the registration of a property with the RTB, for instance, which I've suggested in the second stage debate of a bill last week. I do think that certain instances you do have to look at state service providers or quasi-state service providers and give them a break, because it does have a knock-on effect in the context of the cost to families. I understand Minister Fingal has been referenced on a number of occasions this evening as having the highest rates collection profile in the country, and I of course welcome that as a former councillor in Fingal and indeed as one of their local deputies. But Deputy Murphy tipped upon one of the reasons for that, and that is of course that it has one of the lowest rate levels in the country. Now you could counter that by saying that because it's one of the newest, fastest growing local authorities in the state, with all that fresh developable land which has had commercial parks delivered on it, among other things, that all of these businesses are relatively young and therefore they're used to paying their rates and they're different than high street in provincial towns in Ireland and all the rest of it. I don't necessarily accept that as a point, but it should be borne in mind as part of the revaluation process which is being updated in this bill, which I welcome. It's still the case that two adjoining counties could be revalued 9 years apart, if I'm not mistaken. And to me, that's a problem. And it was a problem when the revaluation occurred in 2006, I think, in Fingal. The property market crashed in 2008, and clearly people in Fingal felt a little bit aggrieved that they were being revalued at the top of the market, and only a few short years later, as businesses were shutting up shop all over the place. So there are issues with the revaluation process. But when it comes to two counties that are adjoining one another, if one county is valued in 2019 and one is valued in 2025, and they are so far apart, in the intervening period, the county that was revalued this year might have an unfair competitive advantage over its neighbouring county. So I do understand and fully respect the fact that it does take time to revalue a local authority, as was highlighted by Deputy Murphy in her contribution in relation to the man on horseback who took 20 years to revalue the state, or to value the state, I should say. But the point being is that we're a little more enlightened now, we have more technological solutions available to us, and I do think it's possible for us to perhaps resource it a little bit more in order to get something more out of it in the long term. So I would welcome the Minister's observance of that, perhaps in his summation, either this evening or again whenever this bill should come back to us for the next phases. Just in conclusion, Ciarán, as I've mentioned, the revaluation process, it would be remiss of me not to use this opportunity just to highlight some of the difficulties, though, in making a valuation in terms of the commercial rate for local authorities, particularly in the case of Fingal. I'll give you the example that occurred recently when setting the discount on the LPT in Fingal in September of last year. A few short months later, Fingal County Council presented their annual budget and found an additional €6 million, I think it was, or €8 million, I think it was, sorry, an additional €8 million, which they probably didn't need to actually pass on to the local property taxpayers, because they had found this additional sum of money, which I think had been pre-booked for something that wasn't expended. But the long and the short of it is, Minister, the local property tax variation rate of 10%, minus 10%, could have been the full minus 15%, which would have made a big difference to local property taxpayers in my county. but the councillors made a decision which was too early in my view, too early by 2 months, and the financial position adopted by the local authority at its annual budget in December was different to that presented in October, and thus local property taxpayers across Fingal were caught out. And in the context of this bill and the commercial rates, the knock-on effect, of course, for the commercial ratepayers in Fingal was that the Fingal County Council didn't adjust, to the best of my knowledge, did not adjust their commercial rate level, despite the fact that they had additional funding. So I'd like to see a little bit of uniformity there. I appreciate entirely it's not applicable to this bill, but the overall funding of local authorities is encapsulated by this bill, and therefore it's something that I think the department should consider in the long term. And the other issue that I'd just like to touch on to complete my contribution, Minister, is the issue of shopping centres. The grading at which rates are applied dependent upon where you are in the shopping centre. I'm not entirely sure that there is a waiver or a scheme for such matters in this jurisdiction. I am aware from inquiring with a colleague of mine in a local authority in Spain that is something that they do, that the one at the front of the shopping centre pays a higher rate than the one at the back because they don't get the throughput and the footfall. So I'm not aware, and perhaps the Minister could enlighten me as to whether that is the case, that approach can be taken by Irish local authorities, and if it isn't, I do think we need to make it available for local authorities to actually review commercial rates as they apply to shops at the back of shopping centres, because obviously they're not going to get the throughput. And finally, Minister, just to re-emphasise the importance, in my view, of capturing, if it is legally possible, which is a roadblock that I hit myself when I was penciling or drafting, or I should say, this bill a number of years ago in relation to the non-conforming uses, particularly when a property is operating as a commercial property, even retail I've seen operating out of houses according to planners, but for everybody else it's a retail unit. But they're not paying rates, and they should be. So I do think that that's something that we should look into, Minister. But I thank the Minister for presenting the bill. Thank you.